Awesome. So welcome to the second lecture of the week, second lecture of the class, however you really want to think about it, second video, if you will. Primary goal for today, we're going to try to go over how you find science, how you read science, how you read science, how to kind of write scientifically, and really like, why do we care? What's the big reason why we have to be following scientific literature? And really, what's the big difference between different styles of studies? Do they really matter that much? So let's get into it. Let's dive deep. And the goal is to get you guys done in 15 minutes or so. We'll see how good I can do on that. Cool. Here we go. So, what is peer review? Peer review is largely the scientific process by which we publish research data. It is a chance for your mentors or your colleagues, quote unquote, to actually go through, scrutinize your scientific findings, scrutinize your data, make sure that it seems like it would fit, make sure that you didn't go fabricating data, and make sure that the data is not errant, and really try to protect the sanctity of science, if you will. Unfortunately, it's become a very different, very disgraced arena within science. It's just kind of the way that it goes when you have other people judging other people's works. But there's tends to be a typical process. The researchers conduct the research, right? You conduct a project, you gather results, you gather data, you interpret that results, and you contextualize it into the scientific knowledge. You then submit that manuscript to a journal. It could be JAP, which is Journal of Applied Physiology, EJAP, European Journal of Applied Physiology, Medicine, Science, and Sport and Exercise, etc. Right? It doesn't really matter what specific journal. It doesn't even have to be in the field of exercise physiology. It can be in business. Regardless, you go through peer review. Papers reviewed by your peers, hence the name, and then authors actually have a chance to respond and resubmit to the questions. So let's say that I get a peer reviewer that says, oh, your project's complete crap and this is all wrong, and then I have a chance to come back and basically almost like chuck up certain fingers at him and say, well, no, this is why you're wrong, or this is why I regret to inform you that you're incorrect on this topic, right? Like it's somewhat civil, but it still becomes a little bit embattled at times. But the goal is that it actually helps put out better science. So that's why peer review matters, is because it's controlling what is entering into the scientific field in some way and making sure that the data seems valid and seems legit. So there's really kind of three primary avenues or common types of research in the field of kinesiology. So you're going to have a review. This can be a meta-analysis or a systematic review. This means that it is a compiled bunch of data from other people's research, other people's data, putting it all together and coming up with a study based off of other people's information, other people's data. So it's kind of summative, if that makes sense. There's qualitative research, which is more interpersonal feelings. It's less numbers based, and it's more pulling themes out of words that people are saying and pulling qualities out rather than numbers specifically. And then you have experimental research, which is where you're actually able to get in and manipulate specific variables here and there. Oh, just knocked my boom on. You're able to get in and actually manipulate variables. So if you manipulate a variable, it's your independent variable. And then the outcome variable is the dependent variable. So whatever you're manipulating is independent. The outcome is dependent because it depends on the manipulation, if that makes sense. So the most commonly encountered in the field, experimental reviews, and then qualitative research. That's going to change based on the kind of sector of kinesiology that you're in. If you're in sports psychology, that might be a little bit different. When it comes to reading scientific articles, every article is going to have these sections right here. These 6 sections, I promise you, are always going to be in the article. The order that they might be in might flip around, but they're always going to contain these specific sectors. So the abstract, I figure that we can skip over what a title means, right? So the abstract is 250 to 500 words, and it's it's like a very brief salesy summary of what the research is. Very limited methods are going to be proposed here. Very limited information is going to be put out here. And the results that are the most exciting or the coolest findings from the study are going to be highlighted in this. Some of the other findings that aren't necessarily the most exciting might be buried in the document, but not in the abstract. And then there's a conclusion as well that's kind of like, and this is why this study is so important, blah, blah, blah. There's something that's out there on the internet that I kind of call abstract warriors or keyboard warriors, is the more common term. There's people that go through and just skim abstracts and try to pull information about a field from abstracts. The problem is that you can't do that. It's not scientifically valid. You're not seeing all the methods. You're not seeing the information truly represented. And truthfully, you could be missing the majority of the importance of the study by just reading the abstract. Next, you're going to get into the introduction. And what I want you to think about is that a scientific paper is essentially the shape of an hourglass when it comes to content. So at the very beginning, you're going to have the most broad statements. You're going to be presented with a problem, kind of like if you're reading Ulysses, or you're reading an epic-based issue. Like there's a call to action. There's some big problem that occurs on the front end, and that's what's going on in an introduction. You're starting to tease out why the paper matters. You're starting to slowly hone in on the spear point of why the authors came up with a hypothesis, why they proposed something might happen, and why they did it. What I really want you guys to take away from really an introduction and discussion is that this is where it is open to human interpretation, and it's open to feelings and emotions and bias. So if you're just reading intros and you're just reading discussions, odds are pretty good that you're going to be influenced by the original author's bias or your own bias going into the study. So it's good to read introductions because it gives you a general placement of why the problem exists. But really you need to start diving into the methods to figure out how the individuals went through the study, and then eventually into the results, which we'll talk about. The methods are essentially serving as kind of like a blueprint for how the study happened, right? It's going to show you, or it should technically show you, everything about the research study. So that means the participants, what they looked like, what they were composed of, were they male, were they female, how many of them, were they randomized, or did they self-select into groups? And what you want to do in this methods, and what you need to be able to pull out of the methods section, is exactly how the study was ran. That sounds great. The problem is it's very difficult when you're writing science to make it so explicit. You get cut off at the knees when it comes to page limits and things like that. So there is some liberties that are taken when you're writing a methods section that you kind of have to condense some. So you might leave out a couple of things that seem to be common sense, if you will. Another big thing is that it's going to discuss the stats that were used to get the results. And why I bring that up is because as you go through your classes at University of North Georgia, as you get into graduate careers or you get into professional organizations, you'll learn that statistics matter. The way that statistics are being conducted matters, because at the end of the day, it's how you're able to determine differences in numbers and determine differences in data that may or may not exist. This is quite possibly one of the most important sections of a journal article, and something that you need to read very carefully. Next, you get into results, right? This is the whole reason we read science. We don't really care what the authors think about where it fits in the general scope of science. We care quite a bit about how they ran the study, and then we really care about what they found, because this is the science. This is what matters about the paper, right? This is where the authors are going to actually be presenting the findings of their data. You don't have to pay too much attention to the figure on the right. I just wanted to highlight that this is where you're going to see graphs. This is where you're going to see figures. This is where you're going to see tables. This is what you need to learn how to read, and read very well. So what you're looking at essentially is, what did the statistical analysis reveal? What was the difference in the numbers or lack thereof that existed within the research experiments? Like, this is why we read research right here. And then you move into the discussion. So this is where the authors are basically taking their introduction and flipping it upside down again. So they're starting with a quick summary of their findings. The first paragraph, first 1 or 2 paragraphs, tends to be like a summary of the findings, summary of the results and the methods. And then it slowly funnels open to provide a big picture of where the data fits, this new data, this exciting data, where it fits in the current scientific body. So this is where you kind of get that hourglass shape, right? Like, if you're looking at the introduction, you kind of have this triangle, upside down triangle, and then when you look at the discussion, you have the remainder of the hourglass being shaped. And if you look, they kind of mirror each other in terms of flow and in terms of shape. Again, just like the introduction, what you need to think here is that this is where authors are allowed to essentially interpret the data how they see it. And that's super important in research, because the authors place the data and the researchers are the one driving the question. But this is also where some of the liberties can be taken in what studies specifically that they're contextualizing their findings with. This is a chance for some authors to hide other findings or to ignore other findings, and that's just because humans are invariably biased, right? So primary sections, title, we don't really, a title is just salesmanship. It's a way to get viewers. An abstract, general summary of the study. It's important to skim. It gives you an idea of what the study is going to be about, but don't rely on it, right? Then you get into the introduction. It places the study. It places the information. Methods, we really want to pay attention to the methods, because what it's going to do is tell us how they found what they end up finding in the results section. The results, exactly why we read studies, exactly why we read research and why we care so much about science, is what they found. Why is it exciting? The next is the discussion, and then the discussion is basically just going to say a repeat of the introduction, but it's going to provide a little bit more context for why that study fits or why it's so important right now in Common Era. And that's what you see here, right? Exact same concept, abstract, questions, blah, 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 right? Kind of hourglassy, if you will. So think about sand falling through here. It's as the reader's going through, and you're filling up at the bottom. Same concept that we just talked about, just a little bit different visualization for you. So we got through what peer review research kind of is. We got through how you can read it slightly, albeit fast, but we got through it. So the other big thing is how to find it. So you can use Galileo. It's a great resource. You can use the University of North Georgia Library. It's a great resource. You can use Google Scholar. It's a great resource. PubMed, for most of the medical or kind of clinical, if you will, allied healthcare umbrella, which kinesiology tends to fall under, is the best is PubMed, or at least I think the easiest to use is PubMed. So you can see that you can actually Google PubMed, or you can type in the address right there, that red arrow, that top red arrow, and then you can search whatever it is that you want to look for, right? So let's say I want to look at muscle damage proteins. So I can go in there and I can type muscle damage protein. But what you can see is that it's only going to show me the first 20 results of 653 pages of 20 results, or 13,056 articles. Don't know about you guys. I don't have the type of time to read 13,056 articles, especially when half of them probably don't. Actually, let's be honest, probably all of them, almost all of them, have no application to what I care about. So what's cool about PubMed is that you can actually get in and specify exactly how you want to search. And that's what these kind of search queries are right here, right? Like, you're going to be able to search titles. So let's say I want to look at muscle damage proteins in something specifically. I can bracket next to it and say, I want to search titles. I want to search abstracts, because if it's the most important finding, it's going to be listed in the abstract. I can search titles and abstracts at the same time, and it allows me to kind of filter down my results, right? So I'm looking in a title and an abstract here, as you can see, at muscle damage, and I want it to also include protein in the title or the abstract. And so what you can see is that takes my search query from 13,000 some odd to 33. It's a lot easier to scan 33 titles in abstracts to see if it might be something that I'm interested in. Once I pull those titles or once I pull those papers that I think I might be interested in, then I can read through the whole thing and see, is this what I'm looking for? Or even better than reading the whole thing, I can actually just quickly look through the methods and the results and see if that's what I'm looking for, right? Because that's the crux. That's why we read research, is for methods and results. Pretty self-explanatory. Like, why do we care? What is the big deal? Why is this dude making so much emphasis, putting so much emphasis on peer review research? And really it comes down to this concept of evidence-based practice. I don't care what field you're in. I don't care if you're in teacher cert. I don't care if you're in athletic training. I don't care if you're health and fitness. I don't care if you're in business practices. It doesn't matter. You need to be using evidence-based practice. And here's your definition for what evidence-based practice really looks like. Essentially what it's doing is it is using science, it is using data-driven approaches to make sure that you ensure the best possible outcome, right? So if you're an athletic trainer and you're dealing with an individual that has a concussion, you're going to use evidence-based practice to make sure that you protect that individual. Same thing with ACL tears, same thing with fractures, compound fractures, whatever, right? Like, you want to make sure that the athlete gets back better. At physical therapy, same exact thing. You've got someone that just had a hip dislocation. How can you strengthen that hip best using evidence? You don't want that ever to happen again. But if you're using experimental approaches, you can't promise that you're not as certain that it's not going to happen again. If you use evidence-based practices, then you can be a little bit more certain, or at least you're basing your approach in scientifically valid ways. You're going to get into this a lot more if you haven't already had research methods, research design courses. You'll get into it a lot deeper. I just really want to highlight that evidence-based practice is essentially this kind of Goldilocks area of combining the patient, the best possible scenario for the patient, or for the patron, or for the targeted audience. You're combining the best evidence to try to hit that target audience, to try to improve the patient's well-being, and you're also bringing in your clinical expertise. So let's say that you've been in the field for 15 years, you know an approach that works, but there's this new fancy up-and-coming approach that seems to be working most of the time. Is it better to go with the approach that you know works, or is it better to use the experimental approach that you're not positive or you don't have full faith in, right? Evidence-based practice is combining all of these values and all of these thoughts into one. So you can use evidence-based practice in teacher certification. You can use it in physical therapy. You can use it in resistance training. It comes down to, how are you programming? Are you using linear periodization? Are you having a deload week the week before competition? Are you allowing athletes to recover before they're competing? Same thing with athletic training. Are you using the most up-to-date approaches that are the best for not just the athlete, but also in your mind are going to result in the best improvements for the individual? So why do we care? We've just kind of gone over this the most. It's to keep knowledge and skills current. It's to save time, to find the best information. Realistically, it comes down to this quote right here, and that's, kill as few patients as possible. It can't be any more blunt than that. In the opposite frame of things, you can also take it, let's say you're using evidence-based practice for something like business. The goal is to sell to as many people as possible, right? Like, you want to target the individuals at the end and either improve the outcome or not. Here's some of the major barriers for evidence-based practice. You can see that there's overuse, underuse, and misuse of evidence. So that is when people purposefully misguide the medicine. They purposely misguide the message. They purposely misguide the scientific approach. There does require time. Learning how to read science takes a long time. Learning how to interpret science takes even longer. Learning how to apply it takes even longer. It's a process, and starting now, you're going to better yourself by being able to go here, right? Like, it will give you the trump card at Thanksgiving when someone tries to tell you that the body exclusively relies on carbohydrates for energy, and that's why you're eating mashed potatoes. And you can just throw down the hammer of science and basically be like, here's my science hammer. You're wrong, man. There's intimidation by senior experts. Just because it's been done for forever in a specific way doesn't mean that it has to always be done that way, right? Like, there's valve replacement surgeries in heart surgery where they used to crack the chest, spread open the chest, and go in and do valve replacements. Now they just go in through the femoral artery and they like feed a little valve up all the way through the arteries, or I guess through the femoral vein, and feed it all the way back into the heart, and replace the valves, right? Like it's just because something's always been done doesn't mean that it's always needs to be done. And really, like, you might be intimidated one day by your bosses to use a practice that they're more familiar with compared to what the science is actually saying. And then really access to that evidence and poor decision making are some of the other major barriers. So here's the 5-step process to evidence-based medicine. It's ask the question, access the information, appraise the data, apply the data, and then reassess it, right? So you're going to ask the question, what is the best way to do this? You're then going to go to the peer review science, go to PubMed, go to Google Scholar, and you're going to read through the methods and the results of those papers the most to make sure that what you're reading makes the most sense. You're going to take the data, you're going to take the results that work the best, the methods that work the best, right? You're going to apply those to your population, to your specific scenario, and then you're going to assess, right? So you're going through the scientific process here with this, but you're doing your own experiment in some way, shape, or form. You're using someone else's research to review and assess it and make sure that you're trying it, right? Like that's evidence-based practice. When it comes to how you're reading or kind of where you're going to be grabbing information for evidence-based practice, you need to think of this funnel right here, kind of this pyramid, if you will. There is different levels of evidence. So the highest levels are going to be Cochrane reviews and meta-analyses. So what that means is they've taken every single study that's published on that topic, combined the information, and they've pulled out one finding. Basically, they've pulled out the result. Is this likely to work or not to work? Is it likely to improve or make worse, right? So like they're pulling multiple studies and multiple findings for this. Then you can get into randomized control trials and case cohorts and control studies to really look at the individual responses. So this author found this author found this, Parker Hyde found this, whereas Joe Schmo found this. If they're in agreement, that's awesome. If they're in disagreement, who's to say one is more right than the other? That's when you start pulling all those together and start making those systematic reviews and those meta-analyses. Why are we not pulling information from textbooks? Or why do we use textbooks instead of peer review science? Or why do we not use textbooks and instead use peer review science? What you really need to understand is that textbooks are review papers in some way, shape, or form, but they don't have to be peer reviewed, right? Textbooks do not go through a process of peer review all the time, and they're often biased. So it almost gives a more liberal interpretation for the author of the textbook chapter, right? Like I've been able to write in my career, I've written 3 or 4 textbook chapters, and they're fun to write because you're not quite storytelling, but you're actually opening up a little bit more to interpretation. You're kind of loosening up then a little bit more than you would be if you're writing a peer review article, because you know that it's not going to be peer reviewed. So they're also dated, right? Like how many times have you ever bought like the 2nd edition of a textbook instead of the 10th edition, right? Like, does that mean that there's been no improvements in science in that however long that is, if it's yearly, in that 10 years or that 8 years? You're probably missing out on quite a bit of updated data, or at least updated references that you can pull in the future. Textbooks are really a great thing because they provide an overview. They provide good background knowledge, and they provide easy to consume background knowledge that doesn't require as much skill in reading. But that's what they're there for, right? Like they are there to provide the background information, the background knowledge. The research is there so that you can actually learn the most up-to-date information and really start becoming an expert in the field. So you guys can read through this summary on your own. Essentially, peer review science is your best friend moving forward in the field of kines. That means that anytime you have a question, you should be hopping onto some sort of Galileo or PubMed or Google Scholar and trying to find the primary sources yourself first before asking the question. Or if you ever wonder, go there first before you start pulling news articles and stuff like that. Don't become an abstract warrior, and then make sure that you're using evidence-based practice. You'll learn more about it as you go through classes here at UNG, but there's no reason why you can't start now. If you're building your own exercise program, use science, right? Like that's a great way to get started with evidence-based practice. Try it on yourself.